welcome to all of you again. And in today's video, we will know about the two literary terms from the book of M.H Abrams, that is a glossary of literary terms. And today we will know about the two literary terms that are criticism and cultural studies. So let us start with first one, that is criticism. So criticism, or more specifically literary criticism, is the overall term for studies concerned with defining, classifying, analyzing, interpreting and evaluating works of literature. Theoretical criticism proposes an explicit theory of literature in the sense of general principles, together with a set of terms, distinctions and categories to be applied to identifying and analyzing works of literature, as well as the criteria. Criteria means the standard or the norms, so by which these works and their writers are to be evaluated. The earliest and enduringly important treatise of theoretical criticism was Aristotle's Poetics in 4th century BC. Among the most influential theoretical critics in the following centuries were Longinus in Greece, Horace in Rome, Boileau and Sainte-Beuve in France, Baumgarten and Goethe in Germany, Samuel Johnson, Coleridge and Matthew Arnold in England, and Poe and Emerson in America. Landmarks of theoretical criticism in the first half of the 20th century are I.A. Richards. His book was Principles of Literary Criticism, published in 1924. Then Kenneth Burke. His book was The Philosophy of Literary Form, published in 1941, and revised version was in 1957. Then R.S. Crane. He edited the book Critics and Criticism, published in 1952. Then Eric Auerbach. His book was Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. It was translated in 1953 and reissued in 2003. And Northrop Fryer, his book was Anatomy of Criticism, published in 1957. So since the 1970s, there have been a large number of publications, continental, American and English, proposing diverse radical forms of critical theory. These are listed and dated in the entry Theories and Movements in Criticism Recent. Each theory in that list is also given a separate entry in this glossary. For a discussion of special uses of term theory in these critical movements, you can see post-structuralism. Now, practical criticism or applied criticism. Practical criticism or applied criticism concerns itself with the discussion of particular works and writers in an applied critique. The theoretical principles controlling the mode of the analysis, interpretation, and evaluation are often left implicit or brought in only as the occasion demands. Among the more influential works of applied criticism in England and America are the literary essays of Dryden and Restoration, Dr. Johnson's The Lives of English Poets, published in 1779 to 81, Coleridge's chapters on the poetry of Wordsworth in Biographia Literaria, published in 1817, and his lectures on Shakespeare, William Hazlitt's lecture on Shakespeare and the English poets. In the second and third decades of 19th century, Matthew Arnold's essay in criticism, published in 1965 and following, I.A. Richards as Practical Criticism, published in 1930, T.S. Eliot's Selected Essays, published in 1932, and many critical essays by Virginia Woolf, F.R. Lewis, and Lionel Trilling Clint Brooks, The Well-Wrought Urn, published 1947, exemplifies the close reading and of single text, which was the typical mode of practical criticism in the American New Criticism. For a more recent example of practical criticism applied to a single poetic text, Surprised by Sin, by Stanley Fish, Surprised by Sin, the Reader in Paradise Lost. So practical criticism is sometimes distinguished into impressionistic and judical criticism. Now, impressionistic criticism. So, impressionistic criticism attempts to represent in words or the felt qualities of a particular passage or work, and to express the responses or the impression that the work directly evokes from the critics, as William Hazlitt put it in his essay on Genius and Common Sense, published in 1824. You decide, the lines are, you decide from feeling and note from reason that is from the impression of a number of things on the mind, though you may not be able to analyze or account for it in the several particulars. And Waterpeter later said that in criticism, the first step forward, seeing one's object as it reality, is to know one's own impression as it really is, to discriminate it, to realize it distinctly. And posed as the basic question, what is this song or picture to me? In the preface to Studies in the History of the Renaissance, published in 1873. At its extreme, this mode of criticism becomes an Anatole Francis phrase that ventures of a sensitive soul among masterpieces. Now, Judical criticism. So, judical criticism, on the other hand, attempts not merely to communicate but to analyze and explain the effects of a work by reference to its subject or Ghanization techniques and style, and to base the critic's individual judgments or specified criteria of literary excellence. Rarely, rarely are these two modes of criticism sharply distinct in practice, but good examples of primarily impressionistic commentary can be found in the Greek Longinus, uh, Leonardo's Mona Lisa in the Renaissance in 1873, and some of the 20th century critical essays of E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf. Types of traditional critical theories and of applied terms can be usually distinguished according to whether, in defining, explaining, and judging a work of literature, they refer to the work primarily to the outer verb, or to the reader, or to the author, or else treat the work as entity in itself. So, first, mimetic criticism. Mimetic criticism views the literary work as an imitation or reflection or representation of the world and human life, and the primary criterion applied to a work is the truth or adequacy of its representation to the matter that is represents or should represent. This mode of criticism, which first appeared in Plato and in qualified way in Aristotle, remains characteristic of modern theories of literary criticism. Then pragmatic criticism. Second, pragmatic criticism. It views the work as something. It views the work as something which is constructed in order to achieve certain effects of audience. Effects such as aesthetic pleasure, instruction, or kind of emotion. So, and it tends to judge the value of the work according to its success in achieving that aim. This approach, which largely dominated literary discussion from the versified art of poetry by Roman Horace, 1st century BC, through the 18th century, has been revived in recent rhetorical criticism, which emphasizes the artistic strategies by which an author engages and influences the responses of readers to the matters represented in a literary work. The pragmatic approach has also been adopted by some structuralists who analyze a literary text as a systematic play of quotes that affects the interpretative responses of a reader. Then third is expressive criticism. Expressive criticism treats a literary work primarily in relation to its author. It defines poetry as an expression or overflow or utterance of feelings, or as the product of poet's imagination operating on his or her perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. It tends to judge the work by its sincerity or its adequacy to the poet's individual vision or state of mind, and it often seeks its work in the work evidences of the particular temperament and experiences of the author, who consciously or unconsciously has revealed himself or herself in it. Such views were developed mainly by romantic critics in the early 19th century and remain current in our own time, especially in the writings of psychological and psychoanalytic critics and in critics of consciousness such as Georges Paulet and the Geneva School. Then fourth is the objective criticism. So, objective criticism deals with the work of literature as something which stands free from what is often called an extrinsic relationship to the poet or to the audience or to the environment, environing word. Instead, it describes the literary product as a self sufficient and autonomous object, or else as a word in itself, which is to be contemplated as its own end and to be analyzed and judged solely by intrinsic criteria such as its complexity, coherence, equilibrium, integrity, and the interrelations of its component elements. The conception of the self sufficiency of an aesthetic object was proposed in Kant's Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, published in 1790. It was taken up by the proponents of art for art's sake in the latter part of the 19th century, and has been elaborated in detailed modes of applied criticism by a number of important critics since the 1920s, or including the new critics, the Chicago School, and proponents of the European formalism. So an essential enterprise that the ordinary reader takes for granted. It's establish a valid text for the literary works. See, you can see for this textual criticism. It is also a frequent procedure to distinguish types of criticism which bring to bear upon and influences literature various areas of knowledge. So in the attempt to identify the condition and influences and that determine the particular characteristic of a value of a literary work, accordingly we have historical criticism, biographical criticism, sociological criticism, psychological criticism, and archetypal or myth criticism, which undertakes to explain the formation and types of literature by reference to the views about myth and ritual in modern cultural anthropology. So for a detailed discussion of the classification of traditional theories that is represented in the essay, you can see M.H Abrams another book, The Mirror and the Lamp, published in 1953, chapter 1, Types of Oriental of Critical Theories. So this is all about the criticism. Now let us discuss about the next term, that is cultural studies. So cultural studies designates a recent and rapidly growing cross-disciplinary enterprise for analyzing the conditions that affect the production, reception, and cultural significance of all types of institutions, practices, and products. Among these, literature, as accounted, is merely one of many forms of cultural signifying practices. A chief concern is to specify the functioning of the social, economic, and political forces and power structures that are said to produce the diverse forms of cultural phenomena, and to endure them with their social meanings, their truths, the modes of discourse in which they are discussed, and the relative values and statues. So, one precursor of modern cultural studies was Ronald Barthes, who in Mythologies, published in 1957, it was translated also in 1971. In this book, he has analyzed the social conventions and codes that confer meaning in such social practices as women's fashion and professional wrestling. Another was the British School of Neo-Marxist studies of literature and art, especially in their popular and working class modes. As an integral part of general culture, this movement was inaugurated by Raymond Williams' book Culture and Society, published in 1958, and by Richard Hogarth's book The Uses of Literary, published in 1958, and it was reprinted in 1992, and it became institutionalized in the influential Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, founded by Hogarth in 1964 in the United States. The work for cultural studies and had its roots mainly in the mode of literary and cultural criticism known as the New Historicism, with its antecedents both in post-structural theorists theorists such as Louis Althusser and Michael Foucault, and in the treatment of culture as a set of signifying system by Clifford Geertz and other cultural anthropologies. A prominent endeavor in the cultural studies is to subvert the distinctions in traditional criticism between the high literature and the high art, and what were considered the lower forms that appeal to a much larger body of consumers. Typically, cultural studies pay less attention to works in a established literary canon, that to popular fiction, best selling romances, that is, love stories, journalism, and advertising, together with others' art, and have mass appeal such as cartoon, comics, film, division, soap operas, and rock and rap music. And within the areas of literature and the more traditional arts, a frequent undertaking is to move to the center of cultural study those works that is, it is claimed, have been marginalized and excluded by the aesthetic ideology of white European and American males, particularly the products of women, minority ethnic groups, and colonial and post colonial writers. Politically radical exponent of cultural studies orient their writings and teaching towards the explicit end of reforming existing power structures and relations, which they consider to be dominated by a privileged gender, race, or class. So many cultural studies are devoted to the analysis and interpretation of objects and social practices outside the realm of literature and the other arts. These phenomena are viewed as endowed with meanings that are product of social forces and conventions and that may either express or oppose the dominant structures of power in a culture. In theory, there is no limit to the kinds of things and patterns of behavior to which such an analysis of cultural texts may be applied. Current studies deal with the spectrum ranging from the vogue of body building through urban street fashions and from cross dressing to the social gesture of smoking a cigarette. So this is all about the cultural studies. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If